Hey guys, today I'm going to be reviewing the Black Flag album Family Man, and this is a very interesting record to me because Black Flag are, of course, a legendary punk band who got famous for just being very aggressive and thrashy, I should say. And a big credit of that should go to frontman Henry Rollins, who just has a persona and personality and energy that's really like very few others, maybe only Jello Biafra and a small handful of other punk frontmen can really compete with Rollins. So that's why when he decided to take a step back from actual vocal work and instead read off some of his poetry on this record while letting the rest of the album be totally instrumental it was a pretty bold move, all things considered, considering he is the reason, or arguably at least the reason that Black Flag are now so iconic. And a lot of people hated it, and that's understandable, but personally, I actually kind of ended up loving it. Now, before I get into the actual analysis of this album, I do want to say that I do think I have a slight bit of bias when it comes to at least the poetry portion of this record. I'm just a massive fan of general creative writing, especially poetry. I've done quite a bit myself, so I do think I have a slight bit of bias of being excited to hear an artist that I already really like sharing more than just, song lyrics, like actual poetry that they've written, which in this case is Rollins reading it off. But I do think that the quality of the poetry here does go beyond my own personal enjoyment of creative writing and poetry. I think there is some really, really fantastic writing here. All of the poetry here was written by Henry Rollins himself, and to be honest, I really like his writing style. I do think that he kind of, I don't want to say breaks the limits of what people expect from poetry, because obviously a darker side of poetry has existed ever since poetry and creative writing has become a thing, really. But I do think that he does kind of break away from what people expect poetry to be. He isn't very eloquent or anything like that. And some of this stuff almost verges on urban surrealism at a certain point, but I do think it's all really well written and it doesn't come across as trying too hard to be sinister or dark or brooding. It's really just Henry Rollins at his most lyrically raw, just in this case it's poetry rather than the actual lyrics to a Black Flag song. Let Your Fingers Do the Walking is a personal favorite reading of mine on here. It's very intense and just creepy almost to a certain extent. It's just, it's almost violent how raw it is. It's an interesting reading, and I do think that even if you aren't a fan of Black Flag, that you should at least try it out. It's a short track. All of the poetry reading on this is short. So I really do recommend that if you don't want to listen to the instrumentals because you're not a fan of Black Flag's performance style, to still listen to the first side of this record, which is just exclusively Henry Rollins reading his poetry. It's short and it's an incredibly well written experience. Another track, the title track, is another cut that really just stands out to me. It's sinister, it sounds evil, it doesn't just sound evil, it's written evil. Rollins does a very emotional and straightforward reading, but still enough that it really just has a lot of power behind it. It doesn't feel like Rollins doesn't really want to be there. You can tell that's genuinely writing that he was passionate about making, and that passion just happened to go in a very dark direction, which is obvious by the poems itself. But again, I really do recommend reading the poetry side of this. My only issue with the poetry side of things on Family Man is just the quality of the actual recordings. And I understand that this record was kind of probably made in a rush, at least to some extent, but it does bother me that songs, or I should say poems like Hollywood Diary and No Deposit, No Return, sound very clear and are easy to understand, whereas things like Salt on a Slug kind of are muddy and have very poor recording quality that was obviously in front of a small group of people. And I guess you could say that that is sort of Black Flag's aesthetic, very gritty, raw, and just straightforward with their sound. But it does bother me that there is no consistent sound quality throughout this record, at least on the poetry side of things. Even with there being at least nothing truly unintelligible on here, it's just, it is a slight flaw that there's no sort of consistent, crisp cleanness or murkiness in the audio. Like I said, all these are relatively short poems, and they all culminate into what becomes the 9 minute long track, Armageddon Man. Now, Armageddon Man is again Rollins reading spoken word poetry that he's written, but it does have an instrumental backing it this time, a very odd instrumental. Guitarist Greg Ginn has obviously decided to play a very unorthodox set of chord progressions and notes as things slowly descend into insanity, which the rest of the band does along with him. And I do think that even with this track being 9 minutes, it doesn't really feel like it. It feels like it goes by pretty quick. It's a really enjoyable track, maybe my favorite on the album, actually, all things considered. And to be honest, I kind of wish that they did more stuff like this. I mean, Armageddon Man really shows what Black Flag could do with the concept of a spoken word track, and it may not seem like Black Flag are the kind of band that could be able to pull something like that off, but they really do here, and I greatly wish that they had done more work like this beyond Family Man, but I can see why they wouldn't have, considering how negatively this was received back in the day. Greg Ginn is a fantastic guitarist, and he really defines the band and its sound in his own kind of unique way as a performer. Bassist Kira Rosler and drummer Bill Stevenson. I'm sorry if I pronounced their bassist's name wrong. I completely forgot to look up how her last name was pronounced before I started this recording, so bear with me in that aspect. They also do some really strong work on this record. Stevenson also may be a very familiar name to other punk fans. He was a drummer for the Descendants at one point, who are also an equally iconic band as Black Flag. And they both act as a very tight rhythm section overall, and they manage to kind of stand out as individuals while adding a great supporting backbone for Black Flag. And all three of them really shine on the very overly long titled track, I Won't Stick Any of You Unless and Until I Can Stick All of You, which is a great title, but I hate reading it for a video. But nonetheless, they do provide some really excellent work in all honesty. I will admit that while I do find this record very underrated, I do think the B-side is a slight drop in quality from the A-side, the B-side being the instrumentals and the A-side being the poetry reading. And while it may only be a few songs, the two of them aren't very special. Those tracks are Long Lost Dog of It and Account for What. They're just kind of good instrumentals that don't really provide much to the experience of listening to a Family Man overall. And there are some really strong tracks on here, like I said before. I won't stick any of you unless and until I can stick all of you. Okay, maybe I do like saying that song's title a little bit. Is really good. The Pups Are Dogging It is a fantastic and memorable instrumental. It's just the matter of not being as memorable as the A side, but nonetheless the B side is still very strong. I just would recommend the A side over the B side any day. But the poetry reading is fantastic. The instrumentals are equally as great as the poetry reading. It's just I think that's a very slight dip in quality, almost unnoticeable, but not quite. So overall, Family Man is a very overhated album, in my opinion. I can't deny that I really love this record, and actually it's one of my favorite Black Flag albums. And I've never really understood why so many people have despised it. I mean, I can't help but wonder if maybe this were completely poetry or completely instrumental, if maybe it would be slightly more well-liked. Obviously, there's no way that this concept would have become one of Black Flag's most beloved records, with Damaged obviously being one of several much more popular options. But this album, in my opinion at least, really pushed the usage of poetry and punk music at the time, just as the Dead Kennedys were doing in the exact same decade. And I think that's something to really talk about that not a lot of people discuss because they're too busy focusing on other much more famous Black Flag efforts that, while well written, were kind of a little more lighthearted in their own way at times, or even darker depending on what record you choose. But overall, I do think that Family Man is an album that deserves more credit, even if it's not a fan favorite or anything like that. So overall, I'll say this album gets 4 stars out of 5. This is a really great record, and I do recommend that you listen to it. And with that being said, that is the end of this review. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.